Welcome to the NYU Law Forum. Today, we are gathering to talk about an issue that feels like it could have been ripped from the headlines and that's changing around us at this very moment, the power of the president to staff the government. The president has some powers to staff the government, even far-reaching powers, but of course they're not absolute. They involve, in particular, checks from the civil service laws and checks from the Senate. We're joined with four incredible panelists to discuss the relationship between these powers and these checks. I'll start from the end and move across. So Senator Bob Kerrey, who's known to many of you already, U.S. Senator from Nebraska for many years. Next to Senator Kerrey, we have Professor Christina Kinane of Yale University, Professor of Political Science of the Institute for Social and Policy Studies and the Faculty Director of the Millstone Fellowship in Public Service. Next to Christina, we're joined by Gregg Nunziata. Gregg is the Executive Director of the Society for the Rule of Law. Before that, he worked for many Senate Republicans, including as Chief Nominations Counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee. And then to my right, Professor Sarah Binder, Professor of Political Science at the George Washington University and a Senior Fellow at Brookings. My name is Noah Rosenblum. I teach legal history here at NYU Law. I have a series of questions for the panelists and then some questions online. We'll save the last 10 or 15 minutes or so for audience questions. I'll remind you at that point to come to one of the two microphones that have been provided so that we can make sure to pick up your question for the broadcast. So with that, I want to start by framing the problem. So this is a question for Christina and Sarah, the two political scientists on our panel. Christina, Sarah, one of my colleagues once stopped me when I joined the faculty in the hallway, and he said, Noah, I always thought of the President of the United States as something like the CEO of America Corp. Is that right?
Sarah, you want to take it?
I'll go first. All right. You can hear me? Awesome. Great. So first, thanks very much for including me and for all the excellent questions already, Noah. So I think there are two ways to answer this question. One would be to take a look at what has happened the last 2 weeks with Trump and draw some lessons about the capacity to reshape the government as if you were a CEO. And we will come to that for sure today, I'm sure. But the other way to answer it is to think how typically we think about the constraints on presidents if they were to try to act like a CEO. And I'll just put 2 or 3 of them up on the board and then we can see where to take it from there. First, and some of these are kind of basic constitutional notions, right? That we have separate institutions that share power. So when we're thinking about appointments, we have in mind certainly Congress, but especially the Senate. So, and then as we'll see, of course, the courts. It is not a top-down hiring process in any way under normal constitutional processes. So first and foremost, we don't typically think, and it's going to vary across the type of appointments, whether it's those for which Congress has determined you need Senate confirmation versus civil service appointments and so forth. So separate institutions, if they're sharing power, is going to put a constraint on acting like a CEO. Second, I think it's very tempting to think of the president as the driver of like staffing the government, right? But keep in mind, it is Congress that has scaffolded all of these positions in statutes. So first and foremost, through enactment and later reform of the civil service, and second and relatedly, by creating federal departments and agencies and dictating rules both for hiring and it oftentimes for firing. Does the Senate, think about these questions that get embedded in statute. Does the Senate have to confirm you? Do you serve at the pleasure of the president? Do you, in theory, it seems appropriate to add, serve for a fixed length term? Is there a requirement for partisan balance? Can the president fire you? If so, for cause? And now we need to ask, what does for cause newly mean? So obviously we're learning this first 2 weeks. Legal limits don't deter Trump and his advisor from acting like a CEO. And then finally, just to keep in mind, the courts, separate institutions sharing power here. Some of these potential guardrails are outside, obviously, Congress and the White House. We obviously have increasingly conservative courts stepping into the fray. They tend to favor presidential authority over Congress and the Senate when it comes to constraints on presidential appointments and firing for sure. So I'm not a lawyer or a law professor, but there's a lot of unsettled legal and constitutional questions here. So not quite a CEO, but Trump certainly wants to push it that way.
I mean, also, thank you, Noah. Thank you, everyone. It's so great to be here. But Sarah, that was amazing. I mean, there's not much to cover more than that. I would add just one thing that I think that it's important to remember is that as an administration and as a legacy, the president has only the executive branch to use in order to establish and see forward the policy priorities that he would or she would like to have that administration pursue. And it's often and has long been the prerogative of the president to make sure that the individuals who are in those decision making positions, the leadership positions at the top of this giant bureaucracy that's created largely by Congress through statute, that those individuals share his policy preferences, and in order to ensure that those priorities can be met within the 4 years, because he only has 1,460 days to, if there's one term, maybe more.
I'm feeling better already.
But so to the question, Noah, of is the president the CEO of some AmeriCorp? I mean, not technically. However, there is a lot of parallels to that in the way of needing to direct a vast set of actors towards a single shared vision and a single shared perspective. And we've seen through, and I think that we'll cover a lot of this throughout the panel, that this new administration is coming on board with the explicit objective of remaking the government in order to pursue those policy priorities, in order to make sure that at the end of 4 years, all of those boxes are checked, and all of the promises made during the campaign, the promises made in various very nude-stat-oriented rhetoric is going to require that the president reshape at least the top level of the bureaucracy, but even further in potentially in order to meet those priorities.
So staying on this theme, a question for you, Senator Kerrey. When you served in the Senate, how would you have reacted to the idea that the government worked for the president, or that the president was something like the CEO of the government?
Very negatively. I mean, first of all, no CEO has an elected board. So the clear answer to your question is emphatically no. There's no comparison between a CEO and the President of the United States. The President of the United States is Article 2 of the Constitution. The President doesn't have a vote on the Hill. Elon Musk doesn't have a vote on the Hill, thank God. All they can do is recommend. And every single one of his cabinet appointees has 535 elected people on their boards. So if you want to be the head of the Veterans Administration, you have to deal with the fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene is on your board. And other people. You got 535 elected people, 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate, and they're your board of directors. Bobby Kennedy, if he survives, and I don't think he will as a consequence of him being pro-choice, but if he survives, he will run out of gas in a hurry, having to answer to his board, because they're going to call him up all the time. And he's not used to that. And a lot of people aren't used to being grilled by the Congress over and over and over, oftentimes not for anything of substance, but just to get on the news. So most important thing about my answer to your question is, I spent 16 years in elected office. I ran for governor when I was 39, first office I ran for and won. Then I left and ran for Senate a couple years later. 16 years without Google, without Facebook, without the cell phone. That's when I ran. And it's dramatically different as a consequence. Now, I'm in a wheelchair, not for much longer, I hope. So I watch a lot of YouTube, and I can, there's a lot of things that I learned as a consequence of that technology, but my God, can it whip you around. It is, somebody said, well, only 20% of the American people oppose gun control. 20%? Just 20%? That's enough to defeat almost anybody. And a Congress that increasingly is running in uncontested races. So I think the technology is dramatically altered. It's here, and it is what it is, both for the good and bad, American politics.
So, Gregg, just to follow up here, you have tremendous experience in the Senate as well, but from the other side of the aisle, would you say that the perspective on this question was any different in the Republican caucus?
Well, first, thank you also for having me. This is great. When I applied to NYU Law School, I got waitlisted. So 25 years later, it's good to be in the building. I never did hear back from admissions office, I don't think. So
We'll see if we can fix
thank
that.
you. So it's good to be here. Thank you all so much. Do Republicans see it differently? I think there are. The short answer is no. I mean, both parties tend to have evolving views about the power of the presidency depending on who's the president and whether they share the same party description. But no, I mean, the government, we're trying to balance a couple of things in the Constitution. I mean, in one sense, we want the government to be controlled by the president. We want us to be able to elect a president who can enact his agenda with faithful lieutenants, and that's democratic. But we also don't want a corrupt presidency. We don't want partisan hacks. We don't want corruption. We don't want people who will put the president's personal whim above the law. There's a difference between serving the president's policy agenda and serving the president as a person. You know, if you even think about our revolution and our founding, most of the experience that America had with British tyranny was the various ministers of the ministers and appointees in the colonies of the king. And we came to be a country really worried about a government staffed by people who would flatter the executive rather than serve the people. So we try to strike this balance. I don't know that it's always easy and it's not always done well, but you know, I think the Senate advice and consent process is part of that. And there's lots of instances in which I've been disappointed by some decisions that have been taken by senators of both sides, but it's been more durable than you might think, and a lot of what's durable about it is behind the scenes. I mean, there's a serious vetting of nominees, and senators ask them hard questions with the cameras off. So no, I mean, I think it's an important conversation to have. There's a bit of a dialectic, but no, the government doesn't all work for the president.
So I just want to pick up on where you ended, this question of the advice and consent process and how it actually works. So these questions are for the senator and for Gregg. Let me start by going back to the senator. Senator, could you talk a little bit about how you approached your responsibility to advise and consent? So Gregg was just telling us that at least when the cameras are off, people are getting asked hard questions.
Look, I'm not in office anymore, so I don't have to bullshit you. So I wasn't on judiciary. I wasn't a lawyer. I recognized that coming to Washington and having a job of writing laws, I needed a little help. So I went to the Supreme Court and listened to at least half of oral arguments every year for my first 6 years. And I came to respect the court, and still do, in spite of Alito's dalliances. I still have an enormous amount of respect, because you can't go into the court and throw an applause line out there. You can't go into the court and use populist rhetoric. You got to make an argument, and you either win or you lose that argument. If you lose, you've lost. You can't appeal behind it. You maybe go to Congress to get it changed. So, I mean, my view of the matter was that the president should be given a lot of authority, a lot of flexibility, but if I didn't like the nominee, I voted against Clarence Thomas. And by the way, his mother-in-law was from Nebraska. And she followed me around all the way in 1994. Why did you vote against us? Jesus. I mean, I think you're at liberty to vote no if the president nominates somebody that you don't like.
And
it is easier if they're of a different party. So it was easier to vote against Clarence Thomas than it would have been if Bill Clinton had nominated Clarence Thomas.
And what about the cabinet nominees, Senator? Did you approach the judicial nominees differently from confirming?
It's lifetime. It's a lifetime appointment. Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, in particular, I don't know how many of you have ever been to an oral argument at the court, but if you've been to as many as I have, you come away saying, this is a really important position here. I mean, I appointed judges when I was governor. And the system was a bunch of lawyers that interviewed people and made recommendations. And what mattered most to me was, could that person make a decision? Could they sit up there, listen to the evidence, and make a decision, knowing that at least 10% of the time, please come on in. People are going to be mad at the decision. It's not easy to make it. I think it was Mencken that said, people say that injustice is the problem. Injustice isn't the problem, he said. It's justice that's the problem. And that's what a judge has to do. So, it's a much different set of circumstances. I could always zero out the budget of a cabinet appointee. I could always annoy a cabinet appointee and get them to sort of bend a little bit in my direction, especially when we had earmarks.
Gregg, how about yourself? So you were saying a moment ago that at least when the lights are off or when the cameras are off, the senators would be asking hard questions of cabinet nominees and trying to pin them down in different ways. What was your impression of the way in which the Senate approached this advise and consent responsibility?
Well, I think there is, as the senator suggested, there's a lot of pressure for senators to support nominees of their own party, particularly at the cabinet level. I was just saying to someone before over lunch that I don't think Pete Hegseth would have been confirmed for a less important position, meaning to say he has serious background issues that would disqualify your average nominee for one of the 1,000 jobs that you can get nominated for. But the stakes were so high for defense secretary, and it was a priority of the president, and so there was immense political pressure on Republicans to support him. So there's that dynamic. But yes, I do think this background investigation process is real and important. And it was one of the things there's a lot of things that have been bleak about the last few days from my perspective, but one of the things that has pleased me is that for the most part, Republican senators have insisted on regular order for processing these nominees. The president wanted to bypass traditional FBI review, the traditional committee process, perhaps have mass recess appointments through an engineered recess, and senators refused to do that and wanted to go through this process. And again, much of it is behind the scenes with Senate lawyers and senators working through the process with these nominees. The other thing that's important about the process, aside from making sure folks are qualified, it's a real leverage point in oversight. So senators get guarantees or commitments from cabinet secretaries, even of their own party, that they will come back to Congress, that they will be transparent with congressional oversight. And that's a really important part of the advise and consent process that I think is overlooked.
So Christina, Sarah, we just heard about the sort of view from the inside. I was wondering about what the view is from the outside when we think of it as an academic area of study. Do we have data or information about how effective the advise and consent process is? Does the president have a way of getting around it? And Gregg just mentioned the possibility of an engineered recess. What does, coming at this as academics, what's your take on advise and consent as a way of creating this divided government with shared powers?
Sure. Well, so the long and short of it is that confirmation delay is real, and it's getting longer and longer over the recent administrations. I imagine Sarah will probably get into that aspect of it. What my own research and expertise is in this opportunity that confirmation delay or the absence of a nominee presents for presidents to use unconfirmed appointees in these positions that require Senate confirmation. And Trump is not, in his first term, was not someone to shy away from that. He used actings at an incredible rate, but it wasn't considerably unprecedented. Just some statistics to throw at you. For the first Trump administration, he had in the top-level PAS or presidential appointments that require Senate confirmation, in the top-level PAS positions of the 15 executive branch departments, if you counted the deputy secretaries, secretaries, assistant secretaries, attorneys general and assistant attorneys general and the like, he had 363 confirmed appointees to those positions throughout his first term. He had 458 actings who served in those positions in an acting capacity. Now, granted, the confirmed appointees served for longer. On average, they served for 704 days. His actings served for about 277 days. This, of course, has the giant outlier of Chad Wolf, who was the longest-serving acting cabinet secretary until Julie Su in the Biden administration. But these unconfirmed appointees are missing exactly the preemptive oversight opportunity that Senate advice and consent presents to them. But importantly, Trump was not the first person to use actings, actually far from it. In data that I've spent years collecting, going back to 1981, I can tell you that of 6,200 individuals who served in these top-level positions, 44% of them did it on an acting capacity. That is to say that they served it for at least one day, but on average, 290 days on average they served without the Senate advice and consent. And we might think that this is necessary at transitions. This is necessary to shore up the continual working of government. This panel is on staffing the government to make it work. So actings are provided as a legal tool that Congress has granted to the president through the Vacancies Act and its various reforms. But its reforms have extended the time through which actings can serve. And now under the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, passed in 1998, they can serve for 210 days if the vacancy doesn't occur at a transition. If it occurs at a transition, that extends to 300. But the important part about the FVRA is that when the Senate is not moving on to confirm a nominee, the longer that a nominee sits with the Senate, the longer the acting can serve, because the FVRA allows that time limit to be paused. And so with every extended day of the Senate not providing an action, whether it's to return the nomination, whether it's to outright reject it, whether it's to negotiate behind the scenes so that the president withdraws it, or if it's to call it to a vote and actually confirm the nominee. Without that action, actings can continue to serve in an unconfirmed power, and they perform all of the duties and authorities of the position. And so unless they're serving unlawfully, meaning that they serve beyond that time limit, or they don't meet the qualifications set out by the FVRA or the organic statutes that govern those positions, their decisions are upheld. So when we talk about the Senate confirmation process as political scientists, we've often paid attention to that delay, which I'm sure Sarah will talk about. But we've assumed that that's the only route through which the president can staff these important positions, and it's just not. It's just not.
Do you put those statistics in your questions when you're doing examinations of your students?
Absolutely. Anyone of my students at Yale are well aware of the prolific occurrence of actings across the government.
Well, can I one of the things I'd ask is, there's been a growth in Senate confirmed positions.
Of course, yes.
Why?
That's up to Congress. Congress is.
Why is Congress expanding the number of Senate confirmed positions?
Do you want to take that, Sarah?
So why are they increasing? I think, well, the two things we want to think about. So first, growth of federal government is certainly going to be key here, right? Create a new program, expand a new agency. You end up, sometimes you have senators sometimes asking that these be Senate confirmable positions.
It looks better on your resume, Senate confirmed.
Sure.
Well, for sure, and also think there have been efforts to try to reduce the number of Senate confirmed positions.
Yeah.
And my sense from those reforms is that, well, clearly it's not working because they're increasing. And, you think, does the person on the Appalachian Mountain Water Commission need to be Senate confirmed? Those people, as I understand it, actually love the honor, the prestige, I'm going to be a Senate confirmable position, even though it takes months and you might actually not get confirmed. So it is hard politically for people to give up these strings of the imprimatur of.
It pays more.
Yeah.
And Sarah, did you want to say more about the delay question that Christina was inviting you to speak about? You don't have to, but I just wanted to give you the chance.
The thing I would only add is sort of back to your question about is advice and consent effective? And I think it's fair to ask or to think that it's effective for whom, and that what presidents want and what senators want, or at least we would think at least senators from the opposite party, what they might want, might be different. And so I think it's a little hard to say a single answer about effectiveness. And then there's also the question, how do we know, right? We can point historically and even today to, depending on what group we're looking at, right, is high levels of confirmation, really high confirmation rates. Well, is that because the presidents get who they want? There's this norm of giving the president who he wants, put his team in place. That's possible. It's also possible that at least historically and of late, but not too recently, that presidents would try to anticipate what senators are who they're willing to vote for, at least at the cabinet level.
That's a really important point. I mean, I think that, in fact, Hamilton says in the Federalist Papers, talking about advice and consent, that the check will be one that normally operates silently because the president would be too mortified to put forward someone who was unqualified. And that does happen in reality. You get when I mean, I guess I didn't get the calls directly, but I worked for senators who did, and you get calls from the White House, particularly if you're in the same party. What would you think about this person for this job? And there's a lot of kind of pre-clearing or feeling out nominees. And clearly, we have a new president who didn't take that approach and is really pushing things.
But you know, you work for a senator who just went across, I think on a voice vote, to be Secretary of State. Is that because he was a former senator?
Senator Rubio? Yeah, yes. I mean, I think it helped a lot that I worked for Senator Rubio until he didn't win the primary in 2016. Yeah. I mean, I think Rubio is well regarded in the Senate. It was for he cares most about intel and foreign policy.
Cruz would not have
issues.
gone across.
Cruz
that
would not have
line.
gone through like that, but yeah. Senator Rubio is very conservative, but this was sort of, particularly, it was also for a job where he had worked on a lot of bipartisan initiatives and foreign policy. So, but yeah, traditionally senators have a much easier go of it in getting confirmed. That's maybe less and less true these days. But
So, of course, the Senate confirmed positions are only one part of the government, and so I want to pivot now to talk about some of the other roles in the government, particularly the people below these Senate confirmed heads. So, Gregg, this first question is for you. Until recently, if I said I cared about the civil service and we should pay attention to it, it was a surefire way to kill a conversation. And yet now, of course, it's really quite a fraught aspect of our politics. It's been on the front page of the papers for the last couple days. Can you help us understand why this has happened? Why is the civil service now such a fraught aspect of our government?
this is a very hard question for me, and particularly for kind of the people I work with and represent in my organization, which are a bunch of conservative lawyers who really prioritize the defense of the rule of law and the Constitution and norms and democracy over some partisan commitments. But look, I mean, I think it's been, like Sarah was mentioning before, that Republicans have typically had a stronger view of executive power. That's true, I think, generally, but it's particularly true in not just the power that the executive has vis-a-vis the other branches, but the power that the president has over the executive branch. Conservative lawyers have felt pretty strongly about this for a long time. The unitary executive theory, we tell you, is not a theory, it's a fact. The Constitution says the executive power is invested in the president. And so the other employees of the president, of the executive branch, do work for the president. But, as I think I was saying at the outset, are importantly ought be constrained by law and the Constitution and the demands of their role. They don't serve the president. They work for him, but they don't serve him. And so I think what's happening now is a little bit of a difficult thing for folks from my perspective, because I think for a very long time we've been certainly open to the idea, if not for the idea, of weakening civil service protections, giving the executive more power to demote or remove or fire. Before we just had bureaucrats when it was non-conspiratorial. We didn't use this deep state logic, but deep state rhetoric. But sure, I mean, I think it is true that in any large organization there's some path dependency, and there are agencies staffed by people who want to keep steering the boat in one direction, to mix metaphors. Republicans, I think, have felt broadly that the federal civil service is staffed by folks who are left of center. That may be true. I think maybe some Democrats have felt similar things about the intelligence community or some law enforcement agencies that might have views contrary to where progressives want to go. And it's hard to control the government. So the difficulty for me is that in theory, I am open to the idea of broad civil service reform, assuming a president who's undertaking it in good faith and not trying to turn the government into a personal tool. So for me, the kind of the legal theory and the immediate practical consequences of the moment we're living in are in some tension.
So I think we all, the current moment obviously is weighing on us, and I've got some more questions that'll take us there in a second. But before we turn to the present, I wanted to spend a little more time making sure we understood the sort of structure behind it. So Christina, this is a question for you, which is thinking about this less from the legal theory perspective and more from the institutional perspective. You were telling us a moment ago about actings and how much the president has used them. Do you have thoughts about the president's relationship to that tier below the actings?
Yeah, and to your point of it stopping conversation no longer, yay for bureaucracy nerds. I mean, this is great. Those of us who study this, we're like, yeah, you guys want to talk about this now? We're on board. But to the question of the 2.1, 2.2 million civil servants that are in the bureaucracy. That have served, their careers in these public service roles. I think it's really important to recognize that we often denigrate them and are frustrated with the slow pace of government without recognizing that, in fact, to go back to the founders in the Federalist Papers, slow government is actually what the founders wanted. Like they wanted sure energy and decisiveness in the president and therefore left a singular individual at the top rather than a council or some larger group that would be subject to collective action problems. But they also wanted to ensure precisely why we have separation of powers and why the policymaking process is so fragmented is to ensure that it is slow so that it wouldn't be subject to the whims of mob rule or factions or the like. And I think that it's important to recognize that those two are not necessarily cause and consequence of each other, that we hoped with the civil service reforms to have individuals filling government roles that weren't a part of a spoils system, that weren't simply granted their jobs because they happened to be the best campaigner for a Senate candidate somewhere or the chief of staff for a governor, but rather that they had expertise, that they had an incentive to take a job that paid less than the private sector, that engaged in important policymaking decisions. In fact, when we look at where the policymaking is happening in the U.S. government, 90% of policymaking is happening in the bureaucracy. It's not happening in Congress. Congress, sure, is productive in a lot of different ways, but the place where the regulations that govern our lives are made is in the bureaucracy, and those decisions are made by civil servants who presumably have the qualifications, the expertise, and also a longer time horizon so that they're not driven by partisan motivations. That's actually on purpose. Like the civil service reform was precisely to create a bureaucracy that lasts longer than the 4 years, than the 1,460 days of one single president. And so I think when we think about what it is to have a bureaucracy that is engaged in policymaking, that is large because it has to be, because our policy problems are vast and complicated and diverse, and so we want to make sure that someone who is, an expert in nuclear energy is not the one making decisions about, bridge safety or whether a mine needs to be closed or not, or national labor standards. We want to make sure that the expertise is where it's supposed to be, and so it has to be big, and so I think that gets missed in the conversation.
So there are more questions related to the civil service, and I will get to them in a moment. But by way of getting there, I wanted to sort of bring us up to the present. So we're in the midst, of course, of these civil service memos that have gone out. We're also in the midst of confirmation hearings. Gregg, a moment ago, alluded to the confirmation of the Secretary of Defense. I like your line. He might not have been confirmed for something less important. I will just flag that even some conservative outlets like the Wall Street Journal said, wow, what a rubber stamp confirmation hearing. I'm a legal historian, and so the first question that occurs to me is always, wait, is this new? And so, Senator, I was wondering if you could enlighten us for a moment. Is this a new phenomenon of rubber stamping someone like this who's got such problems for a high role, or is that really an unfair critique? Is the truth that, if it's the same...
I'm incapable of enlightening anybody, including you. So I'll try to answer your question. I do think it's gotten worse in some significant ways. Because what I was talking about earlier, I mean, I'll give you the numbers. You can put it on one of your. I mean, the New York Times, and it's my newspaper of record, but they elected Donald Trump in 2016 by over-reporting the emails of Hillary Clinton. That's my own personal view, and I'm prepared to argue it all day and all night long, with or without alcohol. So, but they did an in-depth exam. The Times does this. They allocated the resources and did a lot of research on what happened in the congressional races and the legislative races in 2024. 8% of congressional races. That's 36 out of 435. 7% of state legislative races were decided by fewer than 5 percentage points. That's the margin of error. That means that the primary is when the election occurs. That means drawing the maps at the state level is more important than the money. The election's over by the time that map is drawn. And the Republicans control more legislatures than the Democrat, than my party does. And they draw the maps. If the maps are drawn according to the proportion of voters registered in either party in North Carolina, the House would be controlled by the Democrats today. So there's and I don't know, but actually, I think I've forgotten the question you asked, because I've been dying to make that declaration.
It's okay, Senator. I appreciate it. The question was just whether this phenomenon of confirming a nominee who seems unqualified is a new thing or an old thing. So having the conservative newspapers criticizing conservative senators for confirming a conservative president's nominee, it's a lot of people on the same team as it were saying, hey, you shouldn't have done
But
this.
Hexas was unusually unqualified. I mean, his worldview is offensive. His political career is as a weekend commentator on Fox. That's it. He was unusually unqualified for a position that is enormously important, a position that the Wall Street Journal cares about. So I think that opposition to Hexas was quite unusual, personally. Yeah, but he's not the only unqualified person, and Democrats oftentimes nominate people who are unqualified, have no idea what's going on. I don't want to out anybody on it, but they do. They arrive at the Department of Labor, the Department of Health and Human Service, and their first question is, what the fuck is going on here? I don't know what to do. And they have a limited number of people they can hire. They oftentimes can't even hire their chief of staff. They're told who to hire. So they have substantially less control. And to repeat what I said earlier, they have a board of elected people. And you can say, oh, I care about the Veterans Administration. I care about the Veterans Hospital in Omaha. I talk about I care about the veteran system, but I care about one hospital in Omaha, Nebraska, and I'll fight to keep it open. And I was successful in keeping it open, even though the utilization was not up to what people would say is justifiable. So it's not, I think, I'm going to give you a positive example here. Trump appointed somebody to be his chief of staff. He finally figured out that just because you're general doesn't mean you can be a chief of staff. He appointed somebody that understands politics, understands the media, understands how Washington works. You can say, well, she worked for a oil and gas company or something. I guess she had some background that people didn't like. But she knows how to do the job. And it's a dramatic change from the first Trump administration. And you need that. You need to be chief of staff for a president is a very difficult job. And you can't freak out. You can't get lost in the weeds. And by the way, everybody, I don't care who they are, will go in, every Democrat will go in and say, I'm going to show that Trump, or I'm going to go show Clinton. Once they get in there, they put their nose up his ass. So it's the President of the United States. You wilt in the presence of the President. Is that right or wrong?
Greg, just to maybe to piggyback a question on Bob's question, which is among one of the other pieces Bob Senator Kerrey just pointed out is that just to maybe reframe that this has happened before, but that it's gotten worse. That there were unqualified people who didn't know what was going on and they'd get confirmed.
I mean, if you vote against Hexas as a Republican, you're going to lose a primary.
Right.
And if you lose a primary, you're a former member of the Congress. And I can tell you, as a former member of the Congress, that qualifying adjective is deteriorating its capacity substantially. You can't even get in a restaurant in New York with that word former in front of your title.
Well, so okay, Greg. So has it gotten the threat of becoming a former? Do you think it's gotten worse?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. It's hard to tease out because there are two different things. For one, historically it is pretty rare for a senator to vote against. I don't have the numbers on me, but it's rare for a senator to vote against a cabinet nominee of his or her own party. I mean, this happens very, very rarely. But Hegseth, I think, is singularly unusual in a nominee for a cabinet position of that level of importance. Who I think, again, if we talked about pre-consultation, I can't imagine a Republican senator who would have given that name as their first 5 recommendations to the president had he asked. I mean, so I think it just seems like such a historically unique moment. And there were 3 no votes. I mean, that's substantial, including the most recent Republican leader in the Senate. So it's concerning. What's more concerning to me than the actual outcome and the numbers is what I saw, which I thought was fairly new. The number of Republican senators I heard justifying their votes simply on the ground, well, he's who Trump wants. Which is just not your job as a senator. I mean, if Trump should just get who he wants, we don't need advice and consent. And there were an alarming number of senators who said that or failed to make any kind of affirmative case for Secretary Hegseth's qualifications for the job.
So, Sarah, I want to take the points that the senator and Gregg just made and think about them from a more, I guess, structural perspective. So Gregg was just saying, we see senators who are changing their relationship to the president. The senator before was saying, the senators, they're thinking about what's going to happen in their primary. So those are structural features of American government. To what extent should we understand this as a contingent story of unusual actors, Trump, Hegseth, versus a story about the structure of our governing institutions?
Sure. So I'll take the structural argument and but also we should leave out a little possibility to say that something is significantly different about these Trump particular nominees. I think two things to keep in mind here. One, we've certainly, as we as political scientists talk all about, is the rise in what we call partisan polarization, but of late what we really mean is just partisanship, team play. Your team's for him, so my team is against him. Now, that sort of mindset permeates Congress. It permeates Washington, and it is certainly seems to permeate the selection, certainly at the cabinet level confirmation, and then often certainly on judicial and an occasional lower court, lower executive branch nominee. What does that look like in practice? I think, so first, we still have, as we've said, like these really high confirmation rates. Of course, sometimes the folks drop out before they're actually formally nominated, not just the Matt Gaetz of the world, but others from other presidents. So high confirmation rates, but then you have to look to what does the conflict look like? So because it's day to day, and I was sitting on a train, I'm a little embarrassed I didn't actually have a data set of cabinet confirmations back to 1789, but I just created one back to 2001. I was on the train. Unfortunately, I can't really see it here, but two things to keep in mind. A short data set here, up from Bush first term to through Trump last week, or this morning actually, on the train at 10 a.m. I stopped. Okay, to the point, if I can remember what the point was. Okay, first, through Obama, there were actually voice votes on confirmation for the cabinet level. In fact, there were 9 voice votes for those top 15 positions. There were no voice votes on Biden nominees and none on Trump. Trump
Is that Obama first term?
First term, yeah. The other thing we'll see if we had. If I had more time this morning to make a better data set that Gregg sort of alluded to, we do see the rise in the partisanship of the vote on confirmation. And third, we see the rise of the use of cloture votes, right, having a cutoff debate. But today, for the last decade plus, it's been just a simple majority vote. So I don't want to say that the change in the rule encourages the conflict, but it certainly registers the conflict, and it encourages the minority party to push for to cloture vote, even just to slow down the confirmation, to stretch it out, to make an argument, to put it in the news, to put Hegseth, to allow, say, for the sister of the sister-in-law, I didn't quite get that one, but to have a deposition and so forth. So it is just far more contentious. I think much of that just stems from a more competitive party system. Control is just around the corner. It matters who's the president. For all these reasons, we can see certainly on the courts particular. So I would say partisanship, rules of the game, and then you just have to add in these sort of Trump nominees, but then the pressure on these Senate Republicans. Just two final things here. I showed it in class the other day. A group was running an ad, it looked like a campaign ad in this past December, running it, I think, only in Iowa, to get Jody Ernst's attention because she was wavering on whether or not to vote to confirm Hegseth, even though she was a woman Army combat veteran and active on questions of sexual assault in the military, neither of which is to Hegseth's, seems to be his forte. So speaking to this, pushing back partisan pressure on you to toe the line, that was quite visible. And lucky for all of you, I can't remember what the other point was going to be. So back to you, Noah.
Gregg, did you want to jump in on this? I couldn't tell.
No, I like Sarah's comment in passing about the competitiveness of our government, which I think is kind of undernoted. When I was kind of coming up as a youngster, Democrats had Congress for 50 years, and Republicans had the White House for 12 years, and it just seemed like people won majorities and stayed there for a while, so you had to work through the government. We've been in this extraordinary period now, going back a couple of decades, where Congress flips every 2 or 4 years, the White House flips every 4 years. So there's this feeling, I think, amongst partisans and congressional staff that we just got to gut out the next 2 years and then we're in charge again. So it's just this, there's not, okay, this is the dynamic that's at play and we're going to come to the table and govern. We just got to beat them next time, and then we can do our stuff. And they're locked in that. I think that's a huge factor at play that doesn't get talked about a lot.
There's a book, just for the students in the audience, called Winner Take All Politics, which actually I suppose Christina and Sarah are, for all I know, they may teach it in their courses, certainly in an American political development lens. Gregg, your comments lead right into one of our first audience questions, so I'll take this opportunity to say if you're in the audience and you would like to ask a question, I invite you to step up to one of the 2 microphones. I have a couple questions that were submitted in advance, and I'll ask one of them now. So this question comes from a former civil servant, a career civil servant, who notes that they were in an office in which they barely survived the first Trump term. Quote, "I got through it thanks to whistleblower protections, but if Schedule F had existed at the time, I'd have been axed long before," end quote. This question asks, basically, how should we think about the effect of Schedule F on some of the questions that we've been discussing? So for those of you who may be less up to speed, Schedule F was an executive order and then a classification released at the end of the first Trump administration that tried to move many civil servants out of a protected category and make them easier to remove. The Office of Personnel Management under the Biden administration promulgated regulations that were intended to make it more difficult to try to repromulgate such a reclassification should a president come to power interested in that reclassification. One of the very first acts that Trump did on returning to power was to promulgate a rule, an executive order. I think it's now being called the Policy Career Order rather than the Schedule F order. But in substance, it's largely the same in that it tries to reclassify a number of officers inside this bureaucracy. So it gets us to the heart of the kind of positions that Gregg and Christina were elaborating, that on the one hand, we want a president who's elected by the people to be able to implement some set of policy programs, and there's been at least one tradition in American political argument that says the president needs more power to do that, and the rejoinder of, yes, but at the same time, we need the people making technical decisions to have a certain amount of expertise and understanding, and that is going to be people inside agencies. So the question becomes, will resurrecting Schedule F kill my old office? If not, will the same hold true for offices without the special protection? So question, I guess, for the whole panel, reclassifying civil servants in this way, what do we make of it?
It's dangerous, personally. I mean, look, the intellectual foundation for the MAGA movement wants regime change. They want to, and by that, they want to change everybody in the government that has a liberal idea. And it used to be, when I first ran in '82, I was a communist because I was a Democrat. And now I'm the devil. Now it's a religious. They see me as the devil. And it's genuinely religious. They want to get everybody out of the federal government who has a liberal idea or a liberal thought. They want to do the same, obviously the same thing with the Congress and the court. And they're trying to do the same thing with universities and with the private sector. So that's their agenda. That's what they're trying to do. And civil servants get in the way. Civil servants have a tendency to say, is this right? Is this against the law? Is this unconstitutional? Trump wants nobody that asks those questions. He wants to clean that whole bureaucracy out so nobody is sitting over there saying, and I promise you Hexas won't, if the president says, I want the 101st Airborne to go to Des Moines, Iowa for a protest, or into the West Village and do the same thing, Hexas will send the 101st Airborne to do it. There aren't, so what they don't like, what the regime change people don't like, are people that have liberal thoughts about, is this legal? Is this constitutional? And they're not impressed by the rule of law. And I personally think the rule of law is a radical idea and still is, but it's not an easy thing to explain to people. So I think it's dangerous. I think there's a lot of people in the bureaucracy that are biased and incompetent and hold things up and make things worse than they actually should. I'm not free of people that I can identify that I'd like not to be in the government any longer. But for the most part, they provide stability.
So if I could jump in there just for a second. So what's interesting about this particular executive order, or the new version of it, classifying rather than Schedule F, but as policy/career, is that it doesn't go down to the lowest level, it takes the highest level. So these are individuals who either were hired at a GS-15 because they have a law degree, or because they have a PhD, or because they have an advanced degree, or they have risen through the ranks to get to that point, and so they have a lot of
Sorry,
expertise.
Christina, just GS-15.
Oh, sorry. It's the highest level of the civil service pay.
General Services Administration.
Yes, so when you're entering in and you're not at a senior executive service, that's the highest level you can get to before you get to senior executive service. But from my perspective, when it comes to thinking about who's going to be then put into acting positions in the leadership, what this does is it creates the opportunity for there to be political appointees in positions that would be eligible to be acting appointees. And so the FVRA allows for, if you've served for 90 days within the last year, for these top-level positions to then be elevated to be an acting appointee in positions that require Senate confirmation. And again, just to put some numbers on it, for Trump's first term, if we classify actings as either political actings, meaning that they're political appointees who are elevated, or careerists, civil servants who are elevated and then are intended to go back to their original position when someone is confirmed. These are supposed to be temporary positions, and careerists who do that do it with the expectation that they're going to go back to their civil service, merit-protected position. If we change all of those positions to be political, in the first term, Trump used political actings more than half the time, 55% of the time, and used career actings 45% of the time. But what this would present is the opportunity to edge that number closer and closer to 100%, because then the people who would be eligible to be acting appointees would be politically appointed. And there's a debate in the literature of political science on competence versus loyalty when it comes to political appointees. The idea that you have this continuum. There's some great political scientists and legal scholars out there who have done this work. And it would lead us to believe that careerists are likely more competent. They are likely more competent because they are policy experts, and political appointees are likely more loyal because that's exactly what they're done. They've been placed in as political appointees. So doing this would create this bevy of political appointees who could then step up to serve for longer periods of time as actings.
Gregg, it looked like you wanted to jump in on this too.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about this, but I mean, I would just, I think, again, we're trying to steer between two things that both have their problems. I don't want Trump or any president to fill the millions of jobs in the government with political loyalists who we cannot trust to serve the American people. But I also don't love the stuff you see on Twitter and Reddit by unnamed government career officials talking about how they're going to work so hard to undermine this president. One of the first things they taught me when I got a job as a Senate staffer was, you don't have the certificate of elections, and neither does even a GS-15 have a certificate of election. And the difficulty is, and they're not always clear cases, is sorting out what's a policy decision and what's not. That's not always clear, but we want government employees to refuse illegal orders, certainly, regardless of how they feel about the president. And we want them to obey lawful instructions from the head of the executive branch when they are lawful. And that's why, just to slide into another thing, I think it's whatever approach we have to civil service reform, congressional oversight is really important. Inspectors general are really important. Whistleblower protections are really important. So when specific facts test these two principles in tension, the American people can see what's happening and what did this particular individual do in this particular case, and was that upholding the law or subverting the president's legitimate policy preferences. I care a lot about DOJ. It's totally appropriate for the White House to impose on DOJ new standards for how they think about prioritizing categories of cases or reviewing mergers. It's not okay for the White House to tell them who to prosecute. And we need people in government who understand that distinction, and we need to protect those who are willing to stand up when they're asked to do something they should not do under the law and Constitution.
Yeah, one thing to insert in this conversation I've made, competency is important, but far more important for me as I look at somebody that's working inside these agencies is, do they abuse the power?
Yeah.
Are they corrupt with that power? By that I mean, many moments where I was with somebody who was they were going to say no, they didn't give a damn. They had a bias against saying yes, and they were going to say no. They didn't care. And if you're a senator and that person is inside the IRS, you can't get to them. You can't have oversight over them. It's very difficult to have any kind of an impact. So that person that comes in that has power and has a bias against saying yes, against helping somebody, and actually has a bias in favor of hurting somebody, can be an enormous problem for, I would say, for the rule of law.
I'll just add, just as to give a sense of how political scientists, at least the two in my family, are debating and thinking about it. And the commute to work's been really tough late. I don't need to say who's on which side. But there are two views here. We won't know them to the end of certainly the end of the Trump administration. Hopefully then we'll know. One view is that like this type of radical change that we've seen and efforts for radical change over the last 2 weeks and the run-up to it, that it's really unlikely in American politics, right? That the ship of state is really hard to move, not just for separation of powers, but all the veto points built into the policymaking process, civil service protections, unionized federal employees, there are unions who then act on behalf and so forth, the wild card perhaps of the courts. But it's hard to see change like that envisioned by Project 2025 and the OMB and Trump. It's hard to see it actually happen. That's one view. We don't know. I don't think we know whether that's accurate or not. The second view is that Trump is sui generis, that we haven't had a president, and I'm sure there'll be disputes about whether Nixon comes close, right, who doesn't seem to believe in the rule of law and has a very different view about the Constitution, which is his and his advisors' right to have, about the inordinate power to the executive branch, even to the extent that appropriations and congressional decisions apparently don't matter. I don't know where we're going to end up, but I think it's important to keep in mind, as I think we all have been, like here's two models and visions here, and one or both could be upsetting to either side.
So I want to turn to questions here in the room. So if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm a JSD student in NYU Law. Thanks for the panel discussion. My question concerns about military. So as a foreigner and international student doing legal theory research, I take military being kind of detached, neutral, and quieter in American politics. I remember one of the interesting teachings from one of my mentors doing comparative politics is, as an American, if you want to learn Chinese politics, change the token of judiciary to military in those authoritarian regimes. And on the balance, as a Chinese, if you want to learn American politics, change the military to judiciary. However, as you may not disagree with me that until most recent, there seems to be very tricky and just a dynamic interactions between Trump and also the military in terms of both domestic things, for example, January 6th, and also some geopolitical issues with the potential nuclear threat from Russia, the communist China, among other things. Here's my question. Do you believe there's any presidential capacity or institutional channels to reconcile the potential urgent issue as we can see it or expect from the just more bustling or the dynamic interactions between the military on one hand and also the rest of the politics on the other hand? Thank you.
That's the worst thing about Hegseth. Hegseth wrote a book called American Crusade. Most unfortunate, 2024. It's not like he wrote it 20 years ago. 2024 he wrote this book, and he says there's a war, and I'm his enemy. So my friends in Nebraska say, can't you be more civil? Well, yeah, as soon as Hegseth gets civil, as soon as Trump gets civil, I'll be glad to. How can I be civil with somebody who declares me as an enemy? Because I have liberal ideas inside my bony little head. So, and he says at some point, this is his language, the military is going to have to choose sides. That is wrong. The military should not have to choose sides. There's a chain of command. The commander-in-chief is the commander-in-chief. He's the president of the United States, but that's military. I don't have to agree with his position on abortion. I don't have to agree with his position on transgenders. I don't have to agree with anything. Any of his political views I don't have to agree with. But Hegseth believes that the military should agree. but the political views of the president, and that's wrong. That's dangerous. I don't think he'll be successful, but he's going to try like hell.
Anyone else want to speak to this question? The civil-military divide and the place of the, we've been talking about the 2.1 million, 2.2 million civil servants, and whenever we talk about people who work for the government, that number always leaves out the number of people in the armed forces, which is, if you're a scholar of the administrative state, maybe the first administrative agency, if we're going to be provocative.
The civil control of the military and the military's removal from politics is just foundational to the American Republic, and it's why it worked for 250 years. We should be very concerned about this, I think. And the early tests you might see are things like domestic use of the military in law enforcement and immigration enforcement, and I think we ought to be really concerned and talking about it a lot and raising the cost of doing it. I think conservatives like me who care about limited government should really care about the idea of the government using the military to enforce laws domestically. And I think we should be able to have that conversation across the political spectrum about the worrisome precedents that sets, even if you don't like the crowd protesting or do like the president giving the order.
Look, if you go in the Pentagon, if you walk in the Pentagon, you're going to think this thing should be a triangle. It's just two. It is impossible to figure that bureaucracy out. Every chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's on the wall of the Pentagon. They took Milley down. They took Milley down and removed his protection. Why? Because he disagreed with President Trump. They took his photograph down. It's petty, it's wrong, and it sends a wrong signal. Thank God we had George Washington as our first commander-in-chief, because he understood that he had to resign his commission, and did. It's extremely dangerous to blur these lines. And they're not blurring the lines. They want the military. Hexus want the military to choose sides. Choose his side in the war with people like me.
Thank you all again. My name is Jeremy. I'm a 2L. We've talked a bit about the philosophy behind Schedule F, the kind of MAGA movement regime change idea, as well as what its effects might possibly be. To ask a question that Professor Rosenblum asked earlier, my question is, where does it come from? Do you see it as kind of a manifestation of a new ideology and a new approach to the government and the administrative state? Or do you see it as something that has longer roots that we can kind of trace further back? Thank you.
I would say that it's replaying history. We're just going back to Jackson. This is literally recreating the spoils system, and it's new as in it's new for the people who are alive right now, but it's not new as in like the history of how the executive branch has been managed.
But the spoils system wasn't all bad. Just to be clear here.
Great.
There's an accountability.
Sure. Hi. I think we've heard a lot of things that are potentially wrong with the current way at the civil service or the appointments process, or things that present risks to the system of government that we kind of value and has allowed us to be successful for so many years. So if you were a leader in Congress today, what would be the first step or two you think we should be taking to change the way that things operate, prevent some of those risks?
Well, I'd have to get a divorce lawyer.
Why don't we take this as an opportunity to offer some sum-up remarks, since it's 2:20 and we'll end in 5 minutes. So maybe we can take this as an opportunity to generalize a little bit and say, maybe there are two different directions we can take this question. One might be, in the specifics, given what we're living through right now, what kind of steps, if any, could be taken either to make the institution of advice and consent work better, or maybe we think it's working fine. Same thing with civil service reform. And then I suppose, we are a law school, so we can give ourselves the luxury of thinking big. This was, of course, a system of government.
People go to think big?
Here at NYU Law, we always think big. We have a constitution that was written in 1787, enacted in 1789 for a republic that, of course, looked very different, with a very different kind of government and staffing. I'm a legal historian, I can't resist, right? The initial revenue system depended on private merchants who were deputized in order to help gather the revenues, because there wasn't anything like a civil service bureaucracy. There wouldn't have been enough people that you could have appointed if you tried to staff it that way, never mind a Jacksonian spoil system. So we have a constitution that was designed for a very different kind of government. We now, of course, have a complex government, but as Gregg was suggesting, some of the values that guide us now are still the same that may have guided us when we put that constitution together. Do we have to change anything big, or can we make this system work for us?
The answer is emphatically yes. I mean, look, I am very optimistic about our system of government. And so number one, don't give up. Number two, look at Congress. There are 535 congressional offices. And let's assume each one of them have 10 staffers. So you're talking about 5,300, 5,400 staffers, and the average age is 30. Young people run the government. And they work for a lot less money than they get in the private sector. They're enormously complicated. You write a check, there's going to be a tax bill that's going to get written in December of this year. And the staff has to write it. Congress will give speeches, and the staff's got to write the damn bill, and they know what's in it, and then they turn it over to the IRS to have to convert it into rules and regs. It works. It's flawed. It's difficult. There's corruption. There's bad things up one side and down the other. I'm militantly opposed to Trump and will argue against almost every single one of his policies, but I haven't given up.
I would say there has been, senators have tried to reform and remake and some big, some small parts of the advice and consent process, and we've touched on some of them. And some of them, I think, generally are probably in a step in the right directions for executive branch nominees, lowering the cloture threshold to a majority vote, even putting aside which presidents make the nominees. I think as a general matter of getting the Senate to move and to vote, simple majority vote to cut off debate, so that there can be a confirmation vote. As a basic kind of accountability move, I think that was a good move. Even though, right, takes longer to get nominees confirmed, and there are more of them, but that can't be solved by the by the cloture reform. They've shortened the amount of time after that cutting off debate for the top level nominees. That's probably helping. Informal change, Senator Thune has said they might actually not take an entire hour to allow senators to take a vote, and sometimes it's longer than an hour. So there's some kind of normative practice changes that would have to happen. They did, at least about 10, 15 years ago, to remove some positions from Senate confirmation. They should try that again, and they should try hard. They should really try hard, because they could achieve that. And that may help with the margins, but the type of things they could do. Other reforms and changes can have unintended consequences. They created a privilege calendar so that you don't have to have an automatic sending to committee for a confirmation hearing. You could skip that and go straight to the calendar. And for low-level positions, what happens when you go straight to the calendar? You sit there for months. And in fact, the privilege calendar was supposed to fast-track nominees. In fact, those take longer on average than the other ones. So hello, United States Senate. So it's not for want of not trying, the double, triple negative there, sorry. Senators at times have tried. I would like to see them go out. Even these small bore changes could make a difference. The broader problem, some people think not a problem, but the broader condition of tight electoral competition and rising partisan team play, ever-increasing partisan team play, and very slim majorities, control means everything, and that is going to be inherited by the confirmation process, and that is really hard to route out.
So we're at time. Let me just ask Gregg or Christina, do you have any 10-second last words?
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. No.
Well, make Congress great again is good. But I just, on the Trump stuff, I think it's really important. He's going to try to do everything he can do. He doesn't want to be unpopular. If there are things you're concerned about now, start thinking about them now and articulating them now so the White House sees there's a cost to doing things that Americans don't support. Two, please try, as you think about these problems, to separate out policies you don't agree with actual threats to the system. Big structural threats, because I may not be with you. I'm a right-winger. I'm not going to be with you on policy concerns many times, but I will be on the structural things. There's a lot of people like me there, and there's a super majority of people in this country who will defend our system if you invite them to the conversation, so please try to do that.
Is that a normative change that you're able to actually say I'm a right-winger at an NYU?
I didn't get in. So.
Well, please join me, right-wingers and further, in thanking these incredible panelists for this incredibly rich conversation. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you so much for joining us. This concludes our session of the NYU Law Forum.
Nice to meet you.
So bad.